Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Allahumma 'allimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima tu'allimuna wa zidna min fadlika 'ilman wa ta'lima innaka ala kulli shay'in qadir. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi salam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we are here for the 11th lesson, right? The penultimate, second to last lesson, alhamdulillah, of Imam Ghazali's Ayyuha walad, dear beloved son or dear child, advice for living right. Imam Ghazali is speaking, if you remember, he spoke about 8 advices. He's closing his letter with 8 advices to his student, so your knowledge will not be against you. And he says there are 4 things to refrain from and 4 things to do in these advices. So that makes 8, right? 4 plus 4. And if you remember, he said the first thing to desist from. What was the first thing, if you remember? The first thing you should not do, number 1, is do not debate anyone on any matter as much as you're able to. And last week, we looked at the details of what that means to debate someone and what it means to when it's permissible to debate someone and when Imam Ghazali is saying do not do it, and the vast majority of situations to debate someone. Why? Because when you debate someone, as we said last week, the purpose of debate, true debate, is to reach the truth. But when it just becomes an argument about showing who's right, that's from the nafs. So when something comes from the nafs, then it's not for Allah anymore. Now you're not trying to argue. And this it doesn't have to be between scholar and scholar. It could be between brother and sister, husband and wife. It could be between friends. Could even be between a person that you drive past somebody in the supermarket and you just take their parking spot or something like that. And you're trying to exchange views, but it becomes emotional. And the point becomes that it doesn't matter. I want to say I'm right, and I want you to stop talking or to admit defeat. This is why that is one of the biggest problems with debate. That's one of the biggest harms and the risks of debate, that you'll start debating for your nafs, your ego. And so that's why Imam Ghazali is saying, as far as you can, as far as you're able to, don't get into debate. People don't come to the truth through debate. Have you ever seen anyone, just look at an argument. How many times have you seen someone in an argument argue with each other? And then after a heated exchange, one of them saying, you know what, all right, you're right, no problem. And just completely surrender to the other person. It doesn't happen. It only happens if one person is totally subservient to the other. They say, okay, and they're not debating. But once that debate starts, once that argument starts, look at the conclusion of all the debates. Unless you have like a debate at like Oxford Union or something where the House gets to vote or something, and even that doesn't change people's views usually. People come to support the side that they're cheering for, So anyhow, we talked about that last week, and we won't go over all of the details of that. And Imam Ghazali says the second thing to desist from. Right, so let's read from Imam Ghazali himself. He says, وَالثَّانِي مِمَّا تَدَعْ, and the second thing that you should leave, right? هو أن تحذر وتحترز من أن تكون واعظا أو مذكرا لأن آفته كثيرة إلا, and we'll talk about that. So the second thing that you should desist from, he says, is beware and avoid at all. He's basically saying be cautious and avoid at all costs, basically, that you become a preacher or a reminder, meaning like a person who gives a talk giver. So beware of being a preacher or admonisher. Okay. إلا أن تعمل بما تقول أولا ثم تعظ به الناس. Unless, in other words, so what is he saying? What do we mean a preacher, right? Bismillah. A wa'iz was a person who would like sit in a masjid and or sit in a public place and or go to people's homes or go to a place, and he's a religious person who would give ringing speeches and gather large crowds and basically is a speaker. It's what we would call in our terms a speaker, right? Someone who gives, and I'm just going like this because obviously everyone's a speaker who's speaking, right? But there are differences. So it's someone who gives talks, or what they call bayan, or what they call even a khatira, like a thought, reminders. So this is called preaching. Preaching means to promote something through speech, to call people towards some sort of religious thing. So you would think, isn't being a preacher a good thing? Isn't that preaching is commonly associated with, kind of like missionary evangelical style, if you want to see in popular Western culture, what the preacher is. Someone who gets up in front of people and gives them a ringing speech. And that ringing speech, a preacher can fill an entire stadium. A preacher can fill an entire stadium, and people become, they almost fawn over them. They become like fans of a speaker, and then they follow the speaker around. And so the speaker uses a lot of emotive speech and uses a lot of expressions, stories to keep the audience interacting with him or her, and keeps the people kind of at the edge of their seats. And the point is to give them religious reminders, but by emotionally swaying them and by making them feel, that they're in part of a narrative, to bring out some type of response from them. Now, there's nothing, in and of itself, I'm not saying this is not a wrong thing, subhanAllah. We hear speakers, you might call them da'is today, du'at, they're giving dawah, influencers, reminders. So even influencers on major platforms. So Imam Ghazali is saying, it's interesting because we would say that that's a very good thing, to be a speaker about Islam. You're giving dawah to Islam. So most people, especially commonly among the Muslim community, they would say that's a really good thing, especially because those are the people who remind other people about the deen. You go listen to talks and lectures when you go to conferences. Much of that is preaching. However, Imam Ghazali was telling his student, don't try not to become one of them. Try not to. And it's interesting because usually the first thing when a student of knowledge becomes a student of knowledge, so many of them, they didn't actually understand what seeking knowledge meant and what being a scholar meant. So you often first get inspired towards being a scholar by a speaker who happens to be a scholar themselves, right? But their main job now is to go around and give talks. Not teaching necessarily, but talks. And there's a difference, like I said, between a preacher and a teacher. In this, a scholar and a preacher are kind of two different functions in Imam al-Ghazali's understanding of how he's speaking about it. A preacher can be a scholar, but may not be. May just be like an educated layperson who can speak very well, and a speaker, a teacher or a scholar may be a preacher, but the vast majority of scholars are not preachers. It's just the ones that you see. So if you ask yourself, who are the ulama? Who are the scholars that you know? If you ask a random person, chances are they will list popular speakers on the internet, whether they are scholars or not. Many times as well, but however, we know, people who, know who the scholars are, they'll be like, oh, a speaker. If you say that's scholar, they might even be like, oh, scholar. Okay, yeah, that is, okay, fine. Yeah, he technically scholar. But they would consider the scholars people who are kind of like locked in libraries and in different functions that deal with that. There's nothing to say that one is good or one is bad. We're not saying that. Or one is better, one is worse, or you should look down. Na'udhu billah. Not at all. What those people are doing is a very, very important function. even through social media, even through YouTube talks, speaker circuits, whatever. There's a very important thing. But what Imam Ghazali is saying is, he's saying you really have to be careful of that. You really have to be careful of that. Why? Because many times as well, when a person starts out wanting to study knowledge, they hear the speakers and the preachers, and they feel that that's what knowledge is. That I want to become like that. So then they want to study for some time, and the nafs very quickly wants to get on the mic. And that is poison for the soul. That is absolutely poison. I'm not saying this for other people. I'm saying for me. For me. I remember when I wanted to go out and study, I wanted to be like the popular speakers I heard, speaking in the conferences. There was no YouTube back then, and we were moved, and you would cry in their sessions and stuff like that. But then you began to think that you're supposed to study in order to speak to people. So so then what happens is, then as a student, you get into university and you're an MSA, and because you're religiously interested, they give the guy, who has a bit of a beard or, reads a bunch of English translation books and say, hey, why don't you give the khutbah? And so immediately that love for speaking and preaching comes out. And you say, yeah, okay, I'm in front of people. And then you begin to learn things. Hey, I can use this. Think about that. You get a line, I can use that in my next talk. Not, I can apply this for myself. I can use this to go towards Allah. Not because of that, but you say, this is a cool thing to say. Oh, I found a cool story on the internet. Oh, and then you like to look up stats. Let me look up a stat, like a non-Muslim stat. Now I'm going to show that I have variety. I'm very educated and intelligent. Let me bring in some stories of the past people, whatever it is. So it becomes a temptation to want to speak. It's as Shaykh Faraz calls it, microphone fever. It's mic fever. You want to get on the mic, and you want people to, all eyes on me. That's what the shaitan tries to do with the preacher, right? And they often, so a preacher is often confused for a scholar. They may be scholars. This is why Imam Ghazali is saying that the harms of it. So he continues. He says, illa. So he says illa. He says it's and the other thing is, like the preacher. Why Imam Ghazali's think about this, right? Especially in their time. It's not like our time, where subhanallah, I mean, if you're on YouTube and you're listening to an Islamic speaker, that's great. Awesome. I mean, you're on Instagram or TikTok and you're listening to, Sheikh so-and-so, Ustad so-and-so. That's great. I'm happy for you. That's a good thing. But in their time, the ulama were plentiful. Each village and town had their muhaddith, their mufassir, their faqih, their spiritual teachers, their Sufis, their the qadi. So they had all the huffav, the qurra. They had the different. Deen was around them, and so preaching began in many ways. Preaching became something where you would gain a lot of following when everybody's into deen. Just think about like a very popular speaker from a non-Muslim secular field. So it became a very, very popular thing, and you'd have a lot of people liking you. And then the other thing is that you control a lot of power. A popular speaker in a Muslim society, Islamic society, bismillah, would have a lot of power. So, you've all heard of the fiery preacher, right? Some guy with a skull cap and like this, and big beard. That's the caricature, na'udhu billah, that they portray in the media. But the idea is, what they're trying to portray is a person who can give a fiery lecture and whip people up into a frenzy and get them into a mob mentality as well. And you see this as well. People who gave a lecture and it was just completely riles everybody up. And then they go out in the streets and, whatever, and then behave in a way that's not necessarily Islamic. And this is very unfortunate, right? And, very popular lectures, people gather to hear a speaker, but that speaker it's about condemning another group of people. basically. Condemning other Muslims, other scholars. Because there's this thing where you want to hear you want to say what your crowd wants to hear. You're not going to discuss something that challenges, that upsets them. That's the thing. A preacher will usually want to say things that pleases their crowd. And so and so there's sometimes as well, there's a need to be controversial. Like I have to say something, kind of push the envelope a little bit, or be political. And this is where, it's religious, but it's political. Which one is it? So these are all the things that Imam Ghazali is speaking about, right? And so he says, unless, he goes, because the harms of preaching are many, unless you act on what you say first. So unless you first act upon what you say, right? Then preach it to people. So this is the challenge of being a preacher, is that you may, the challenge of being a preacher is that you may just, because your job is to speak, and so you're saying a lot of things over, very often. And then the mic's always getting put in your face over and over and over. And so you always have to have an answer. And you may end up saying things that you don't even do yourself. And at some point in time, you may even forget about applying it to yourself and say, look, I've got to give this talk. What am I going to do? People are waiting for me to speak. To the point where, there was a piece of poetry. I actually just, they say that you see a person who doesn't have taqwa, who does not have fear of Allah, and he's calling other people to the fear of Allah. It's like seeing a doctor who's treating other people, but he himself is sick. This is what it is. And preaching, often that could happen, because it becomes an issue of, I'm going to have to tell people, they're expecting me to say something. And it's an issue where you yourself are not practicing upon it. But that doesn't mean, as they say, it doesn't mean that now commanding the good and forbidding the evil should be done. So Imam Ghazali, it's not to say that preaching is always wrong. Okay, it's not saying that. So Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Remind other people, Allah says to the Prophet ﷺ, because indeed a reminder benefits the believers. So there is a lot of good in this. It's needed. وَإِنَّ الدِّينَ النَّصِيحَةِ. This religion is giving good advice to people. For who? As the hadith goes on, وَلِأَئِمَّةِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ عَامَّتِهِمْ. Who is it? Who is this religion about giving good advice to, or meaning well to? The rulers of the people and the generality of the people. So preaching is often to the generality of people, but because of the fact that you're speaking and being admired and listened to, it can cause showing off. May Allah protect us and save us. It can cause showboating and glorifying yourself and pride, and as subhanAllah, our Ustad was telling us, you become a scholar and you're in the masjid and somebody comes up to you and says, brother so-and-so, or someone introduces you as brother so-and-so, or they just take your name. And the shaitan puts inside your heart, you're used to hearing a title attached to your name, Shaykh, Ustad, Sidi, whatever, doctor, whatever it is. And then you hear, this is how the shaitan, it comes. And if we ever feel that, we have to seek refuge in Allah from the shaitan. That's what Imam Ghazali is talking about. And self-wonder, self-admiration. So I gave a really ringing speech that day. So the challenges of it being that you come, after your talk, the way that you assess if you did a good job is not looking at, oh Allah, did Allah accept what I said? Did I change? Did I actually take this advice and become a better person? Myself first? No. How'd I do? Good. How was the talk? It was great. Oh, you gave a great talk. We were all in tears. And is that the point of giving a talk? Is that the point of calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And so this is the part of the and then there's also anyways then Imam Ghazali continues. And he says فَتَفَكَّرْ فِيمَا قِيلَ لِعِيسَى عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. He says, then think a little bit, reflect on that which was said to Isa alayhi salam. It is a narration that they're saying that Sidna Jesus, peace be upon him, said, Ya ibn Maryam, or it was said to him, Ya ibn Maryam, O son of Mary, عِذْ نَفْسَكَ, preach to yourself. فَإِنِ اتَّعَذَتْ, that's a tongue twister. فَإِنِ اتَّعَذَتْ, and if your nafs, if your ego takes the admonition, then preach to other people. وَإِلَّا فَاسْتَحِي مِنْ رَبِّكَ, and if not, then have shame in front of your Lord. Right? May Allah forgive us and bless us. And he says, وَإِنِ ابْتُلِيتَ بِهَذَا الْعَمَلِ, right? So Imam Ghazali is now going to go into this idea that, okay, why? Because now there's another thing, right? This qawl of Isa, or what was said to Isa alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أَتَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبِرِّ وَتَنْسَوْنَ أَنفُسَهُم. Do you, in Surah Baqarah, do you command people to good and you don't do it yourself? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِمَا تَقُولُونَ مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ. Why do you say, Allah says in the Quran, why do you say things that you do not do yourself? كَبُرَ مَقْتًا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. It is something Allah really hates, that you say things that you do not do. So saying things that you do not do is something very disliked to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And part of the job of the preacher is that they have to give these stories. And obviously it's not lost on anyone listening to this that even in teaching this comes up as well. And so this is actually because nowadays as well, teaching and preaching are very, very tied in with each other. Very tied in with each other. May Allah protect us and save us. And oftentimes a scholar who's a teacher will get called to give some talk somewhere. So this is really, every single scholar has to watch out for this. He's not saying don't be a preacher, don't ever give a talk or a lecture. He's saying don't become someone whose primary preoccupation is this. But if you are tried with this. So he continues, وَإِنْ أُبْتُلِيتَ بِهَذَا الْعَمَلِ. If you are tried with this, if you are tested with this job of being a preacher, in other words, saying some scholars will eventually become preachers, right? You'll become a speaker on the circuit, you'll become an influencer, on a YouTube speaker. If you are tried with this, فَاحْتَرِزْ عَنْ خَصَّتَيْنِ, then at least avoid two things, or desist from two things. So if you are tried with this occupation, then desist from two things. And the first thing he's saying, so what are the two things that a preacher should desist from? Now he's saying, okay, you become a preacher, or you have to go preach. Two things you shouldn't do. What are those things? Al-ula. So فاحترز عن التكلف في الكلام بالعبارات والإشارات والطامات والأبيات والأشعار لأن الله تعالى يبغض المتكلفين. This is from two things. Number one, affectation in speech. What is affectation in speech? It is, he says, it's takalluf. Takalluf, it means to force something, to go beyond a natural limit of how you do something. So it's a fake, forced style of speaking. So now it could happen that someone, for example, they preach, they give talks a bit differently than they speak. That happens. I've seen that. I've seen people who, they're very, very loud, or very, very expressive in public talks. When you speak to them personally, they're very soft-spoken and whatever. And it's like, whoa, speak so soft. You see that. But what is a fake force style? So it is the use of, for example, Imam Ghazali says, the use of expressions that are fake. Like you don't use those expressions in your normal life, right? Spiritual examples. So you're focused on always trying to give spiritual hints, right? And you wouldn't teach with this. For example, if you were teaching, you would not be like this. But you're trying to get the crowd and you're being fake with wild utterances. So like it's hard to explain because we don't really, in the West especially, we don't have this kind of like necessarily like the itinerant preacher who goes around mosque to mosque to mosque as much anymore, where they just draw crowds and everybody loves them and whips them up into a frenzy. But you still have this in some places. Whip up the crowd, And so they'll give a wild utterance. Get the crowd, back and forth, you hear this kind of stuff. Like, they're asking the crowd, it's a back and forth with the crowd and they're yelling and shouting and they're getting energy by that. So wild. And then the preacher just said something and everyone went crazy. Oh my gosh, I can't believe he said that. He just said that, And so now he's going into a spiritual state. Dude, can't control him, Now he's just going off on everybody, calling all the rulers, or something like that, So he's just calling everybody out. And then the verses and the rhymes and forced. Like you came and you memorized, I'll get this line at this time, this line at this time, this line at this time. Oh, I didn't deliver this one good. Your voice completely changes. And you start to, you see it. Just kind of like the whole Sunday morning television, These preachers kind of like go into like a very shrill, weird voice. And they modulate their voices, purposely modulating it, then come sometimes going to a whisper and talking like this. And then all of a sudden, and then going back to this. And then, so that keeps the people, on the edge of their seats. What else would that be? Like maybe today, perhaps maybe it could be sloganeering, right? So you see this as well, where you get the crowd into like chanting slogans and chants and cheers in the name of Islam as a way of whipping them up. Mimicry, in a way to mock your opponent. You're like starting to put on these like you're mimicking people. You're behaving in ways the ulama would not behave. In ways that ulama would not behave. And many times the ulama, when they look at some types of preachers, they cringe. They don't want to have anything to do with that style of preaching. Sometimes it involves making proud claims. Many times when you preach, you have to be careful. And then I went this, and then I did this, and I told them, you are this, and they said, oh, Shaykh, and I said, that's okay, astaghfirullah, I'm nothing, you are everything, stuff like that. Humble bragging as well. I am no one, I swear I am no one, and kind of it's humble bragging, calling people out, putting other people down, who are like competing with you or groups that are competing with you, crowd pleasing, right? Trying to do things, just throw things out so that the crowd goes crazy for you. A crowd baiting as well, bringing up issues that will make them mad. Does that make you mad? Yes. What do you think we're gonna do? Get them. Like that kind of thing. Rabble rousing, frenzy whipping. This is kind of like, this is not ilm. This is not ilm. Imam Ghazali is saying, don't get into that. That's the temptation. Because the people who get called into, who get followed are the people who can whip people up and make them feel like that. Then Imam Ghazali takes a little bit of a detour from his two recommendations, and he says, لِأَنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى يُبْغِضَ الْمُتَكَلِّفِينَ. Allah hates those people who are forced. They have takalluf in their speech, right? Now, this doesn't mean if it can be done naturally. We'll talk about that in a second. So, an example of takalluf, I remember this. When we used to do, like, when we became Muslim, we used to have this kind of like a show, like a dawah show, like a dawah kind of thing that we used to do in like auditoriums of masjids and stuff like that. And we did this maybe a couple times where, you'd give your speech on how you came to Islam. You'd stand up on a stage, still on YouTube, I think, and how you came to Islam. And I remember, if you look backstage and like the community would come out and listen and they'd be crying, everybody would be affected by it. People would come up and become Muslim, come up on the stage. People would bring their friends, they'd come up and become Muslim. At the end of it, people would come and donate money to your cause or whatever it is. I remember backstage, like all the new Muslims that are there, practicing lines when they're about to get up. And I remember, okay, you're reviewing your paper. What are you going to say? I'm going to say this. That's preaching. You're getting up there, giving your story, but you're practicing that line to deliver so that people like what you say. This is what we were doing. And I realize now, it's like, man, that was really bad. And a lot of people, when they go into knowledge, seeking knowledge, when they realize that it's not all bling and glamour, you're not getting called to the conferences and whatever. It's like, it's not a glamorous job necessarily. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, I don't know about this anymore. You know? May Allah forgive us. So then Imam Ghazali says, وَالتَّكَلُّفُ الْمُجَاوِزُ عَنِ الْحَدِّ يَدُلُّ عَلَى خَرَابِ الْبَاطِنِ وَغَفْلَةِ الْقَلْبِ. He says, being forced and affectatious in your speech that crosses the limits, it shows that you have a ruined inner self and a heedless heart. Because you're more worried about impressing other people than looking at where are you in what you're saying to other people. You're not thinking about the fact that you're speaking to Allah. We have to think about that. When we speak, we're speaking to Allah, right? We're speaking to Allah. As what Habib Ali said, what did he say? Remember that when you're dealing with other people, you're speaking to Allah through those people, you know? And so when you're trying to put on a show for people, and you're affectatious in your speech, then really you're only thinking about how other people will receive it. So how can you be thinking about what Allah is thinking about you? And then he says, وَمَعْنَى التَّذْكِيرِ, the meaning of reminding. أَنْ يَذْكُرَ الْعَبْدُ نَارَ الْآخِرَةِ, that a servant remembers the fire of the hereafter. What it means to remind someone, that a servant remembers the fire of the hereafter. وَتَقْصِيرِ نَفْسِهِ في خدمة الخالق, and the shortcomings of their own self in serving the Creator. ويتفكر في عمره الماضي الذي أفناه فيما لا يعنيه, and that he reflects on the time of his life that he wasted in vain things. This is reminders. It makes you think. That makes you emotional. It makes you think and reflect. ويتفكر فيما بين يديه من العقبات من سلامة الإيمان في الخاتمة. And it makes you ponder the obstacles ahead for the safety of your faith and the khatima. How are you going to end your life? The end of your life. وكيفية حاله في قبضة ملك الموت. And how you're thinking about, how will my state be when the angel of death comes to take me? وهل يقدر جواب منكر ونكير? Will he be able to answer Munkir and Nakir in the grave? Right? He's thinking, this is what tadhkir should do. وأن يهتم بحاله في القيامة ومواقفها. And he's thinking about to become concerned with their state in the hereafter. What's going to be my position there? وهل يعبر على الصراط سلاما أم يقع في الهاوية? Right? Basically, will he cross the bridge to safety and salvation on the Day of Judgment, or fall into the hellfire below? So this is what now tadhkir is. وَيَسْتَمِرُّ ذِكْرُ هَذِهِ الْأَشْيَاء فِي قَلْبِهِ. And these things just continue in reflecting in a person's heart. This is what reminding is. Reminders that are beneficial for the believers. They make the akhirah come alive. They make Allah, when you hear a person, a spiritual scholar speaking to you, you feel like you are in front of Allah. You feel like Jannah is on your right, Jahannam is on your left. Like that's the idea. Reflecting on yourself, on your own bad qualities. فَيُزْعِجُهُ عَنْ قَرَارِهِ. And so, the point of it is for these thoughts to continue in the heart, so it shakes a person out of their complacency in life. Because as life goes on, we all become a little complacent. Right? We become complacent. We become complacent and we're like, we're good how we are. So then you start to think, why do I need to change? Right? And so this is the thing, it shakes you. It does shake you out of out of your state, but it's to make you ask, not to get emotional, but what can I change? فغليان هذه النيران والنوحات هذه المصائب يسمى تذكيرا. And so the boiling of these flames, of these fires inside the soul, and reflecting on the boiling of the hellfire, and the lamentations of these calamities. What did I waste of my time? What sins did I do? Ya Allah, forgive me. What have I done? What am I going to do now? How am I going to reach the end? What am I going to do in the end? These things, when it starts coming up, and you start thinking, that is called tadhkir. Imam Ghazali is saying that is the meaning of reminders. And then he says, وَإِعْلَامُ الْخَلْقِ. Then he talks about the meaning of admonition, wa'adh, or preaching. What is the meaning of admonition? It is إِعْلَامُ الْخَلْقِ وَإِطِّلَاعِهِمْ عَلَى هَذِهِ الْأَشْيَاءِ. Informing others about these realities that we just talked about and educating them. Now this is what preaching is. Informing others about these realities and educating them. وَتَنْبِيهُهُمْ عَلَى تَقْصِيرِهِمْ وَتَفْرِيطِهِمْ. And pointing out people their own shortcomings, how they fall short in this regard. How much have we worked for the hereafter? How much have we regretted our sins? وَتَبْصِيرُهُمْ بِعُيُوبِ أَنفُسِهِمْ لِيَتَمَسَّ حَرَارَةُ هَذِهِ النِّيرَانِ أَهْلَ الْمَجْلِسِ. And then he's saying, and making people see, not with their eyes, but with the eyes of their heart, the spiritual insight. Opening up people's spiritual insight to see the flaws of our souls, so that we can feel the heat. The people of the majlis can feel the heat of that fire. Right? It's to bring close the realities. That's the whole point. Sometimes you need to hear it from another person. وَتُجْزِعَهُمْ تِلْكَ الْمَصَائِبِ لِيَتَدَارَكُوا الْعُمْرَ الْمَاضِي بِقَدْرِ الطَّاقَةِ. And so you make them see the flaws of their egos and make them feel the heat of these fires in the gathering, and shaking people so that they try to make up for the days that passed and regret their sins. Somebody asked somebody else. Actually, subhanAllah, one of the people involved in dawah talked to a kind of a local preacher and said, you give good talks and you bring in the politics and people get really worked up. And they like what you say, but how many times has someone, after your talk, offered 2 extra rak'ahs of prayer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of what you said? That's what he said. He said, you give a great talk, but how many people decided to actually pray a little bit to Allah extra? Or were you just talking and getting them excited? Right? And he says, then Imam Ghazali says, and it should also cause وَيَتَحَسَّرْ عَلَى الْأَيَّامِ الْخَالِيَةِ فِي غَيْرِ طَاعَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And it should make you regret the days that passed and regret their sins. So then he says, هذه الجملة على هذا الطريق تسمى وعظا. He says, and then he says, so all of these things that we just talked about, these points, okay. So this is what you call preaching, what real preaching should be for Allah's sake, right? Then he gives an example. He says, كما, just like, لو رأيت أن السيل قد هجم على دار أحد. He says, just like if you saw a flash flood coming down a mountain that was about to completely immerse and drown a village, like someone's house, it was about to sweep their house. If you saw a flood coming. وَكَانَ هُوَ وَأَهْلُهُ فِيهَا. And this person that you know was inside that house. Remember, talking about we just had flooding recently, right? In BC and other places, they have a tsunami or something. It's a serious thing. When flood starts coming, people get trapped inside their homes, they drown. What would you tell that person if they were inside their house and a flood was coming down, a flash flood? فَتَقُولُ الْحَذَرْ حَذَرْ. You would say, warning, caution, danger. فِرُّوا مِنَ السَّيْلِ. Flee from the flood. وَهَلْ يَشْتَهِي قَلْبُكَ فِي هَذِهِ الْحَالَةِ أن تخبر صاحب الدار خبرك بتكلف العبارة. So would your heart at that point want to care about informing the owner of that home with affectatious speech? Would you want to flower your speech? والنكت والإشارات, and cool stats and points and innuendos and hints at your speech? No. فلا تشتهي البتة. You would never do that. If a flood was coming to someone's house, you would just tell them in plain speech. فَكَذَلِكَ حَالُ الْوَاعِظِ مَعَ الْخَلْقِ. That's how a person who's preaching should be with people. Speak real. Be yourself and speak to people the way that they need to hear that point, not any other different way. فَيَنْبَغِي أَن تَجْتَنِبَ عَنْهَا. So you should avoid this idea of being fake in your speech. And then he says, وَالْخَصْلَةَ الثَّانِيَةَ. Excuse me. والخصلة الثانية ألا تكون همتك في وعظك أن ينعر الخلق في مجلسك. And the second point, the second thing that a preacher should desist from. So the first point the preacher should desist from is affectation speech. What is the second point? Is that your concern should not be in your preaching that you make people cry in your majlis. وَيُظْهِرُ الْوَجْدِ. And bring out wild spiritual states. Make them go into spiritual states that they can't control. وَيَشُقُّ الثِّيَابِ. And make people start ripping up their clothes and they're falling over, and you're kind of whipping them up. لِيُقَالْ. It's just so people can say نِعْمَ الْمَجْلِسِ هَذَا. So what does it mean? It's to be concerned. So you should not be concerned while preaching that people go cry out in your talks and go into states. So they say, what an amazing gathering. Yo, guys, that was an awesome talk. That was an awesome bayan. It's not about that. It's not about that was such a cool talk, man. You should have heard it, man. We were all in like tears and, oh man, it was like just something else. That's not the point of it. You should not be, meaning it's okay if people cry in the majlis. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong if people even feel extremely moved. Nothing wrong with that. But your goal as a preacher should not be that. Excuse me. Alhamdulillah, Bismillah. لِأَنَّ كُلَّهُ مَيْلٌ إِلَى الدُّنْيَا. Because all of that, trying to get people to react and get emotional, all of that is leading towards the dunya. وَهِيَ تُوَلَّدْ مِنَ الْغَفْلَةِ. And it comes out of heedlessness of the heart. بل ينبغي أن يكون عزمك وهمتك أن تدعو الناس من الدنيا إلى الآخرة. Rather, your point should be, your entire effort and your concern should be to call people from the dunya, from this world to the next life. ومن المعصية إلى الطاعة. And from sins to obedience of Allah. ومن الحرص إلى الزهد. And from greed to abstinence. Right? Leaving off the world. ومن البخل إلى السخاء. From stinginess to being generous. ومن الشك إلى اليقين. From calling people from doubts to certainty in Allah, right? In the hereafter. ومن الغفلة إلى اليقظة. And from heedlessness to being alert and awake and conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the realities around them. ومن الغرور إلى التقوى. And from being deluded by this life to God consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What? تُحَبِّبْ إِلَيْهِمَ الْآخِرَةِ. And you make people love the akhirah. You make people fall in love with the akhirah. وَتُبَغِضْ عَلَيْهِمُ الدُّنْيَا. And you make people hate the dunya. Not talk more about the dunya. Not talk more about politically this and that and whatever. It's you make people dislike the dunya, meaning loving the things of the dunya. وَتُعَلِّمَهُمْ عِلْمَ الْعِبَادَةِ وَالزُّهْدِ. And you teach them the knowledge of worship and abstinence. لِأَنَّ الْغَالِبْ فِي اتِّبَاعِهِمْ الزَّيْغُ عَنْ مَنْهَجِ الشَّرْعِ. Because the overwhelming majority of people, he's saying, in a general crowd, would be that their natures do not fall in line with the Sharia, with the sacred law. Their nature does not fall in line with behaving upon it. وَالسَّعِي فِي مَا لَا يَرْضَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى بِهِ. And it doesn't consist it consists, a lot of people's behaviors consists of going after things which Allah is not pleased with. وَالْإِشْتِغَالُ بِالْأَخْلَاقِ الرَّدِيَّةِ. And getting busied up in low character traits, right? And this is why when a popular preacher whips up a frenzy, gets this crowd into a frenzy, even for a religious purpose, they often go out and do things that are exactly the opposite of what Deen says. So you go and you whip them up about love of Allah, love of the Deen, and we're so jealous for, we're going to defend the Prophet ﷺ, and you whip them up, and they go up and, I don't know, find some poor non-Muslim, na'udhu billah, or somebody who's not following the deen, and they lynch them, or they surround them, harass them. That's not right. This is not right. Or you go on a rampage and start throwing bottles and start burning cars. This is not the point of this, right? This is not what preaching should do. فَأَلْقِ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ الرُّعْبَ, right? And so cast into people's hearts awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَرَوِّعْهُمْ وَحَذِّرْهُمْ, and make them feel shaken and caution them عَمَّا يَسْتَقْبِلُونَ مِنَ الْمَخَاوِفِ, that of what will come at them, what they will face of the scary things, meaning accountability and so on, and punishment and the questioning. لَعَلَّ صِفَاتِ بَاطِنِهِمْ تَتَغَيَّرُ, so people's inner qualities start to change. وَمُعَامَلَةِ ظَاهِرِهِمْ تَتَبَدَّلُ, and so that the way people behave with other people outwardly begins to get better. That's what preaching should do, make us better people inside and outside. وَيُظْهِرُونَ الْحِرْص وَالرَّغْبَةَ فِي الطَّاعَةِ, and makes them bring out the desire to do good deeds, the greed to do good deeds, right? And worship. وَالرُّجُوعَ عَنِ الْمَعْصِيَةِ, and makes people do tawbah. Right? This is what Imam Ghazali is saying. This is the point. And he says, وَهَذَا طَرِيقُ الْوَعْظِ, he says, this is the correct way to preach, وَالنَّصِيحَةِ, and to give counsel. وَكُلُّ وَعْظٍ لَا يَكُونُ هَكَذَا, and so he says, this is the correct way to preach and give counsel, and all preaching that is not like this, on this way, right? فَهُوَ وَبَالٌ عَلَى مَنْ قَالَ وَسَمِعَ, then it is a curse or a calamity on the speaker and the listener. All preaching that does not follow what Imam Ghazali is saying, he's saying, is like, it's a calamity, it's a curse on the one who's saying it and those who are listening. Because they think that's deen, and he thinks that's deen, and he thinks he's being good, and they think that they're getting somewhere, and they're not benefiting from it. They're not benefiting in the real way they could. And he said, إِنَّهُ غُولٌ وَالشَّيْطَانِ, it's a ghoul. A ghoul in Arabic is a ghoul, like a goblin, like a ghost. It is a devil. It is a demon and a devil, that type of preaching. يُذْهِبُ بِالْخَلْقِ عَنِ الطَّرِيقِ, it takes people away from the right path. وَيُهْلِكُهُمْ, and it destroys them. فَيَجِبُ عَلَيْهِمْ, and then what happens is people get so addicted to that kind of fiery preaching. When a scholar comes and tries to teach them, guess what? Too boring. He talks too slow, talks too soft. I fall asleep in his dars. They don't want to take a class. They want to hear, whip me up, get me emotional, give me something, entertain me, basically. Whereas when the scholar comes, I don't want to take a class, I don't want to learn something, I don't want to actually, they won't do it because you actually train them that this is deen, to like this stuff, And so he says that فَيَجِبُ عَلَيْهِمْ أَنْ يَفِرُّوا مِنْهُ, so it is wajib to flee from this type of stuff, right? لِأَنَّ مَا يُفْسِدُهُ هَذَا الْقَائِلْ فِي دِينِ مِنْ دِينِهِمْ, because the amount of corruption that a preacher can do to people's understanding, لا يستطيع بمثله شيطان, الشيطان, even the shaitan himself could not do that much harm to people's religion. Why? Because the shaitan is a whisperer. Whispers in your mind, and then you get an inclination to do something. You don't see the shaitan, you don't hear the shaitan. It's a whisper. And there's temptation. But a preacher who goes off into their own kind of ego trip and that kind of thing, they could say the wrong thing and destroy people's deen and their behavior. So they can do something the shaitan can't do. وَمَنْ كَانَتْ لَهُ يَدٌ وَقُدْرَةٌ, and so whoever has the ability and authority, notice the two things, authority, yad, and ability. يَجِبُ عَلَيْهِ أَنْ يُنْزِلَ عَنْ مَنَابِرِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ أَنْ يُنْزِلَهُ عَنْ مَنَابِرِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. So therefore it is obligatory on those in power to remove those preachers who don't follow this method of preaching from the pulpits of the Muslims. Subhanallah. Think about that. وَيَمْنَعُهُ عَمَّا بَاشَرَهُ, and forbid him from what he is doing. فَإِنَّهُ مِنْ جُمْلَةِ الْأَمْرِ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَنَهْيِ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. So now it is from commanding the good and forbidding the evil. Those rabble-rousing preachers, or the preachers who are just about entertaining people and not calling them towards real reflection, entertaining people basically. I mean, subhanAllah, they were strict in this time. I mean, these days you wouldn't discourage people who are getting a religious talk because that's what they have for their deen. But remember, he's talking at a time when hearing a religious talk might actually distract you from doing more religious things. Whereas now we're in a time where if someone's on YouTube listening to a speaker who's talking about deen, just leave them. That's okay, right? Because what they would be doing otherwise would be worse. In Imam Ghazali's time, people were fasting, reading Quran, doing all these things. So drawing their attention towards an emotional talk would actually be worse for them sometimes, right? Remember, this is the day before TV. This is before, going out for coffee, whatever. People didn't have, this is what they had to do, is to go to listen to talks, visit their family, and the rest was worship, right, of Allah, and gatherings of dhikr, things like this. So he's saying that people, and this is why as well, people don't realize governments have a right to control who's preaching. People think that government has absolutely no role. And they get upset when the government starts to, in whatever country, starts to try to curb a popular speaker who's whipping people up into a frenzy and getting them to kind of get out of control, not follow the law. So then they're like, oh, how come the government is trying to tell this person not to speak? And yes, there are times when obviously governments do the wrong thing. They do it for the wrong reasons, or they try to stop a good scholar from speaking. That's obviously the case as well. That's bad and wrong. And you'll see what later on Imam Ghazali talks about rulers. But they do have a right, if there's a threat or if there's a harm to people's religion, to curb them from speaking. In fact, it's wajib upon them to do that and to take them off the minbar if that's the case. So they do have a right to control harm from happening. And then Imam Ghazali continues, وَالثَّالِث مِمَّا تَدَعْ. And the third point to desist from, أَلَّا تُخَالِطَ الْأُمَرَى وَالسَّلَاطِينَ. Do not mingle with the princes and the rulers. A scholar should not mingle with the princes and the rulers. وَلَا تَرَاهُمْ. Or even look at him. Do not mingle with the princes and rulers or even look at them. لأن رؤيتهم ومجالستهم ومخالطتهم آفة عظيمة. Because looking at them, sitting with them, and mixing with them is a huge calamity. Well, in deen, why is that the case? You have to remember something. Okay, Imam Ghazali is speaking in a time, not when it's like the righteous caliphate and the Sahaba are in control and the glorious Khalif. It's the Muslim world has descended into being about princes vying for power, the sultan and the kind of people many times unfortunately ruling for themselves or their dynasty or their family. And a lot of the princes of different principalities, they became in power by taking over power. They tax people. So a lot of their wealth in this, according to this, there's a lot of oppression. So it's almost like Imam Ghazali is saying his reality that they were living in was that the rulers are oppressors, always, almost always. And that's why you should never mix with the ruler. He doesn't say if they're religious or not religious. He says don't mix with them. Why? Because he's almost saying because you should not mix with oppressors, and rulers are oppressors. Because don't they kill their opponents? Don't they jail people who they are threats to them, like their personal power? Do they not take money and estates and wealth away from people? Don't they tax people? Don't they jail their opponents and anyone who criticizes them goes to jail? Don't they take? Do they ever take, the desires of the country and stuff for themselves and the resources and the wealth of the Muslims for themselves? So he's saying don't even mingle with those types of people. And many times, because they're at the seat of power, all of the worst elements of society are vying for their attention. Mercenaries who kill for hire, whether it's businessmen who are unscrupulous, those who are involved in entertainment and those who are involved in pleasures and desires, things like that, right? So this is why he's saying don't mix with those people. Do not mix with them. And he's saying, وَلَوْ أُبْتُلِيتَ بِهَذَا. He goes, and he says, and if you are tried with this. So he's actually saying that you may have to mingle with the rulers sometimes. You may get called by a king or something like that. But if you're tried with this, دَعْ عَنْكَ مَدْحَهُمْ وَثَنَاءَهُمْ. He says, skip praising them and lauding them. Don't praise them. Oh king, you are like this. Oh prince, you are the best. You are the most virtuous. You are the most noble. Stop praising them. And then don't laud them. You did this for everyone. You did this for everyone. Don't butter them up. He goes, لِأَنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى يَغْضِبُ إِذَا مُدِحَ الْفَاسِقُ وَالظَّالِمُ. Because Allah becomes angry when a sinner, a fasiq, or a zalim, a tyrant, or an oppressor is praised. And many times this happens. You get into, you've got now the royal iftar, and the scholars have to come and, basically show that they're subservient to the king and pretend to praise him and what he's done and, mashallah, and, all this kind of stuff. And he says, وَمَنْ دَعَا لِطَوْلِ بِقَائِهِمْ فَقَدْ أَحَبَّ أَنْ يُعْصَى اللَّهُ فِي أَرْضِهِ. He says, and whoever prays for the prolonged reign of these rulers also loves that Allah be disobeyed on the earth. That's what Imam Ghazali is saying. So you shouldn't even pray. He's saying you should not pray for the prolonged reign of princes and rulers. Don't pray for them to be, oh, may you always be, because if that person is doing something wrong. Remember, again, what are we saying? He's in Imam Ghazali's historical context and understanding, it is like a given that people who come into political power will misuse it as tyrants. And so you're praying for a dictator, basically a tyrant, let's say. And basically by you praying that Allah always keeps him in his position, you're saying that you want his tyranny to continue and continue and continue, right? Obviously, they're not talking about the exception where there is a just, noble, religious, pious, God-fearing ruler. Or in a situation where the Muslims may have a political interest in to preserve their practice and protect their community in mixing with leadership. They're not talking never, ever, ever, like, especially in Western countries. Again, it depends. Like if it's for the benefit of your community, many scholars will interact with the leaders and the governments. But he's saying once you start to mingle with them, get chummy with them. This is why in the past, the spiritual scholars, when, you have the big spiritual masters of India, you have Nizamuddin Awliya, and you have all these huge, lofty scholars and saints who spread Islam all over the subcontinent. And when the emperor used to send them invitation, I'm not coming. Call them to the court, I don't want to come. You come. And this is why in some places, the emperor themselves, they would come to the doors. This is why there's a saying, when you see the emperor, the king, the ruler at the door of the saint, then what an amazing ruler and what an amazing saint. Because he must be somebody, pious to not take the invitation of the king. And the king must be someone very humble to come barefoot, to come to the house or the zawiya or the khanqa or the madrasa of the scholar. And when you see the scholar at the doors of the rulers, let me in, I want to mix with you, I want to be your buddy, give me a position. He goes, then what a bad scholar that is. And what a bad ruler that is as well, who uses their position and power to surround themselves with scholars. This is why the scholars hated to become qadi. Traditionally, they were whipped and they didn't want to become qadi. I'm talking about the imams, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, and then others later on they took the positions because they knew someone had to do that to serve the Muslims. And he's saying, and then he says, وَالرَّابِعْ مِمَّا تَدَعْ. And the fourth thing to desist from. So the first thing, do not debate. Second thing, do not be a preacher. Third thing, do not mingle with rulers. Fourth thing is, do not accept their gifts. أَلَّا تَقْبَلْ شَيْئًا مِنْ أَعْطَاءِ الْأُمَرَاءِ وَهَدَايَاهُمْ. That you do not accept anything right? Do not accept any grants or gifts of the rulers, from princes, basically, from princes. وَإِنْ عَلِمْتَ أَنَّهَا مِنَ الْحَلَالِ, even if you know it is from halal wealth, because a lot of the wealth would be taken from people and belongs to the Muslims, not their wealth, to live in opulence. But let's say you knew this prince had their own business, halal money. They grew their own vegetables, okay? And their own seeds. You know, they got their own seeds. He said, don't accept money from them. Don't do it. Subhanallah. Look at the taqwa of Imam Ghazali. He's saying, لِأَنَّ الطَّمَعَ مِنْهُمْ يُفْسِدُ الدِّينَ, because he says, why? He says, why? Because being desirous of their gifts spoils religiosity. It spoils your deen. لِأَنَّهُ يَتَوَلَّدُ minhu al-mudahana, because being greedy for what they have, the rulers have, because rulers have more than most people have. They can give you a good position. They can make you the head of this, that. They can appoint all of the khatibs, the imams. They can give you money for your project, because it causes sycophancy. It is basically AKA bootlicking and fawning over a ruler. Oh, noble king, thou art the one who, is the shade of the whole, that kind of behavior, and the king is like, and then what does it also do? It causes deference to their views. So the king's like, yeah, what do you think about, and then he has some kind of like wacky idea in religion, but because the ulama are all around him, they can't say no. No one can tell the prince, the ruler, no one can tell him that this is not an Islamic idea. We have to let him do it, right? And so what happens? You have deference to their views. Hey, what do you guys think if we, have a concert inside the masjid and have people mixing inside the masjid? What do you think about that? And, then all of a sudden you become like, oh, I don't know if I can say the truth to him now, because, I'm really close to him. I might get kicked out of my position, or I might get, So then you start to prefer their views. A ruler comes and says, this interest, riba, we need to make it halal for the Muslims, because, we need them to invest and we need them to do this. And can you make a fatwa that says X, Y, Z? Or, this happened as well. Scholars were tried with this in the past. Ruler wants to marry more than this many wives or whatever, and here, I need a fatwa from you to do this. I need a fatwa. I need to eliminate one of my political opponents. Can you give a fatwa that this person's kafir so I can go, do whatever? And so you start deferring to their views. Wa mura'atu janibihim, an agreement with their views and agreement with their oppression. Wa muwafaqa fi dhulmihim, agreement with their oppression. So now they are jailing people and slaughtering them in the streets and doing whatever, and you're like, yeah, well, you start agreeing with them. And this war, this unjust war that they're fighting in XYZ country, sometimes against Muslims, you are now, in other words, you become a scholar of the palace, right? You become a royal scholar now, right? That's very dangerous, as they used to say. وَهَذَا كُلُّهُ فَسَادٌ فِي الدِّينِ, all this is corruption in your religion. وَأَقَلُّ مَضَرَّةِ, and the least of the harms of mixing with the rulers, أَنَّكَ إِذَا قَبِلْتَ أَعْطَايَاهُمْ وَانْتَفَعْتَ مِنْ دُنْيَاهُمْ أَحْبَبْتَهُمْ. He goes, the least of the harms of accepting gifts from rulers is that if you benefit from them, then you will start to love them. Once you accept their gift and start to benefit from their dunya, you start to love them. وَمَنْ أَحَبَّ أَحَدًا, and whoever loves someone, يُحِبُّ طُولَ عُمْرِهِ وَبَقَاءَهُ بِالضَّرُورَةِ. When you love someone, you want for them to always be around and to prolong their benefit to you. You want to keep getting that stipend, that grant, that special gift, the special positions. And you want all your kids to get it too. And you want this and you want that. So you want them to be around because you love them. وَفِي مَحَبَّةِ بَقَاءِ الظَّالِمِ إِرَادَةُ الظُّلْمِ عَلَى الْعِبَادِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And by loving a tyrant, you love oppression on Allah's servants. And you love the ruin of society. وَإِرَادَةُ خَرَابِ الْعَالَمِ. Not society, the world. Because tyranny takes away justice. That ruins society and ruins the world. And by loving an oppressor, by taking things that they have, you begin to love Allah, the oppression of Allah's servants. Just imagine that. A person who unjustly, a scholar who rubber stamps an unjust war is actually rubber stamping the killing and the oppression of innocent people. May Allah protect us from ever getting into that situation and guide our scholars and our rulers out from that. فَأَيُّ شَيْءٍ يَكُونُ أَضَّرْ مِنْ هَذَا الدِّينِ وَالْعَاقِبَةِ. So what is worse for your deen and your hereafter than being the cause of, than this? وَإِيَّاكَ أَن تَخْدَعُوا بِإِسْتِهْوَاءِ الشَّيْطَانِ. And so beware that you are fooled and deceived by the whispering of the shaitan. What does that mean? Do not be fooled. وَقَوْلِ بَعْضِ النَّاسِ لَكَ بِأَنْ. Don't be fooled with the shaitan's trick by what some people say to you. بأن الأفضل والأولى أن تأخذ الدينار والدراهم والدرهم منهم وتفرقهم بين الفقراء والمساكين فإنهم ينفقون في الفسق والمعصية وإنفاقك على ضعفاء الناس خير من إنفاقهم. He said, do not be fooled by what some people say. It's better to take the money of the rulers and spend it on the poor rather than they spend it on haram, because they're saying the rulers will spend it on haram. So rather than they spend it on haram, might as well take their money they're giving you and spend it on the poor. Great. He's saying, فَإِنَّ اللَّعِينَ, for verily shaitan قَدْ قَطَعَ أَعْنَاقَ كَثِيرٍ مِنْ النَّاسِ بِهَذِهِ الْوَسْوَسَةِ. Because the shaitan has cut the necks of so many people with this waswasa. You're taking money from an oppressor, from a compromised source. Well, I'm going to do good with it. But you don't realize you rubber stamp that person's oppression. You become attached and beloved to this person. And now if you cut off my funding, my project's finished. What am I going to do? That's what you do. And you say, I can't speak up about this injustice. I can't tell them, King, what you're doing is haram. SubhanAllah, I do recognize the great privilege that I'm in right now to be in a country where I can say what, this kind of things. But there are many scholars who wouldn't even be able to read these words. They wouldn't even be able to read this book. And so how would you expect them if they got close to rulers and took money from them? Because once you take money, you're compromised. You have a debt that you owe to someone. So make sure when you take a gift from somebody that you don't mind being influenced by them as well. And so then finally he says, وَآفَتُهُ فَاشٍ كَثِيرٌ. And he says, and the calamity and harm of doing this, of this mentality that I'm just going to take the tainted money from tainted sources, from the rulers. I'm not going to fall in love with the rulers. I'm going to spend it on the poor. This is a trick of shaitan. In fact, the big spiritual masters of the past would not even take anything from the rulers. The rulers would send bags of gold. Bags of gold. Did you know this? That the rulers would actually, the emperor would bring dinars and dinars and dinars at the houses at the khanqa, at the spiritual lodge of people like Nizamuddin Awliya and other people. Here, take all the wealth. I'm donating. They wouldn't want to touch it. They could take it and feed all the poor. I don't want anything. But they would like the poor man who has 2 gold coins. If he came with 1, they would take that because it's barakah. When you take from people whose wealth is halal, their niyyah is pure, there's barakah. When you take from people whose wealth is tainted, there's no barakah in that. You sell out your deen. He says, so there's a lot of widespread calamities by doing this. And then he says, وَقَدْ ذَكَرْنَا فِي إِحْيَاءِ عُلُومِ الدِّينِ فَاطْلُبْهُ ثَمَّةً. He says, and we've mentioned this all. So many have been misled by this. The harms are great. And finally, last line, for more, see Ihya Ulumuddin. That's Imam Ghazali himself is saying. If you want more information on this, see Ihya Ulumuddin. And then he goes into, right? So what are the 4 things that you do not accept from? Now we'll take questions, okay? So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. So what were the 4 things that Imam Ghazali said do not do? Do not accept gifts from rulers. Do not debate. do not be a preacher, do not mingle with rulers, and do not accept their gifts. But in each of those things he said, but if you have to debate, do it this way, right? If you have to be a preacher, do it this way. If you have to mingle with rulers, do it this way. But he never said to accept gifts that you do it this way. Because many times as well, even in Western countries, you might get a grant to do something, but you have to make sure, right? I mean, there's obviously a very different siyasa or way. You have to consult senior scholars. I'm not going to say that in this case. I'm not applying it to a modern context. Consult your ulama and the elders of our communities as to how they work with people. But you have to make sure that you're not rubber stamping some kind of legislation that ends up harming Muslims in another way or something like that. So may Allah make it easy. Imam Ghazali is, this is the end of the book. Next class is the last class. And out of the 8 things, he's going to talk about 4 things to do and concluding prayer. So it's heavy because it's the final advice he's giving the students. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us act on these advices and benefit from them and draw closer to Allah when we listen to these things. Because it's not just about scholars and preachers. It's about what can we learn for ourselves to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and become more sincere. Are there any questions?